And we know that when type 2 diabetics start on insulin, it doesn't really help. It doesn't alleviate the underlying issue, which is actually insulin resistance. So we're creating more of the same problem, and they often will gain enormous amounts of weight once they go on insulin. And that's understandable. It's a storage molecule. It's a storage signaling molecule. So it's not the solution for type 2 diabetes. It's a band-aid, just like many of the other medications that we use, because those the treatment options that don't address the underlying insulin resistance will not ultimately be successful in helping people to overcome that diagnosis and put it into remission or even reverse it, because there are ways that that can happen.
Welcome to At the Helm, the health podcast where we explore food as treatment for chronic disease. I'm your host, Dr. Charles Helm. I'm really honored to be broadcasting today on the traditional territory of the Treaty 8 First Nations in the northern rural community of Tumbler Ridge in the foothills of Canada's Rocky Mountains in northeastern British Columbia. I am a family physician, a family doc. I'm also a paleontologist, and I'm fascinated by the intersection of human health and the foods that we evolved to eat, and therefore how, in the space of just a century or two, type 2 diabetes has gone from being a fairly rare phenomenon to being a plague on our society, and why that might have happened. So for all these reasons, I'm just so excited today that we're going to talk to Dr. Don Wilson. Our guest today, Dr. Wilson, is a member of the Heiltsuk First Nation with ancestral ties to the Haisla and the Kitasoo nations on the British Columbia coast, the west coast of Canada. He was born and raised in the beautiful and remote community of Bella Bella. And after first training and working as a nurse, he went to medical school in Calgary and eventually specialized in obstetrics and gynecology. He has now been practicing as an OB/GYN for 18 years, spending time in both Alberta and British Columbia. And he currently lives and works as an OB/GYN in the city of Comox on Vancouver Island. Dr. Wilson's professional interests include Indigenous health, women's health, LGBTQ plus health, and treatment of metabolic disorders such as type 2 diabetes, with a special focus on whole foods and traditional and ancestral diets. Dr. Wilson, Don, welcome to the Helm, At the Helm. It's just so nice to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very kindly for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Can we just start? I just want to ask you about your experience of growing up in the Heiltsuk First Nation and how this maybe shaped your understanding of health and wellness.
Oh, wow, that's quite a big question. First of all, I became a nurse. That was my first, profession that I entered before medicine, and my biggest influence was my mother, because she was also a nurse, and her mother also was a nurse. So I was actually a third generation registered nurse. My grandmother had moved to my home community of Bella Bella in the 1930s to as a nurse, and she signed a contract, sight unseen, to go there and work for 2 years at the hospital in Bella Bella. And then she ended up living the rest of her life there and died in Bella Bella more than 50 years later. So I was always fascinated by the stories that she had about what it was like providing nursing care in our community, way back then, because it hadn't been too terribly long after European contact with my people, which happened quite late. and the hospital was built in our community, and it was the only hospital in the north central coast of British Columbia. So they received patients from all over the place, and they had to actually move around in the summertime with the population who used to move mostly away from Bella Bella to nearby places that had canneries. So her stories were always fascinating to me, and it gave me a a tremendous curiosity about human health. And then my mother subscribed to nursing journals, and I think I read them from cover to cover from the time I was about 8, 9, 10 years old, and I would see them, and I was so fascinated by all of the different stories, the pictures of different medical devices that were being introduced or being used or innovations, and it just gave me a real hunger for understanding health. And so growing up with those two influences, it was always going on in the background. And my mother was a real leader. She did a lot of things besides nursing. She was a coroner, so I heard a lot of stories with her, overhearing her speak to police officers on the phone and just different things about that type of thing. So although it's health adjacent, it was still fascinating to me. And in fact, I almost considered going into forensic pathology as a result of that. In terms of health itself, I had many relatives who developed type 2 diabetes over the years, including my father and pretty much all of his siblings, except for one who had passed away as a result of a boating accident when he was quite young. So I saw firsthand the impact of the introduction of a Western style or colonialized diet in my community. So, I was always wondering, why is it so pervasive and so bad in my community, whereas people are developing diabetes at younger and younger ages and then having all the complications. And in fact, people were dying from it. So that really set the stage for my own journey to explore, dietary and lifestyle options that I had practically stumbled across even after medical school and even after residency when I discovered these things. So that's kind of how I got interested in these areas.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So can you just expand a little bit on your family history of type 2 diabetes? I mean, how severe it was and how many people were involved, and then if that extended to you at all as well, or did you sort of wake up to this before you developed any symptoms, or how did that go?
Yeah, so my grandparents, so my mother is of European descent from Ireland. So, on my mother's side, they're all from the British Isles. And then on my father's side, my grandmother was Heiltsuk and also Kirisu from what's known as Clem 2 on the map. And then my grandfather is Haisla from Kitimat. So those two both actually developed type 2 diabetes probably in their 40s. And my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, actually died of a heart attack at age 51, which was a result of him having type 2 diabetes. And then my grandmother lived to age 69 and had a couple of strokes, which most likely was due to her diabetes. And then she also had cancer at the end, which we know that cancer rates are a lot higher in people with type 2 diabetes. So they didn't live terribly long lives. And my dad only made it to age 70 with type 2 diabetes, and he was a bilateral below knee amputee. He had cardiovascular disease and required cardiac bypass. So he had a quintuple bypass, so 5 grafts done on his heart because of the extent of his atherosclerotic heart disease. And all of his siblings that survived into later adulthood were basically all diabetic, and they died of, some of them are still alive, but um, a couple of them have died of complications of diabetes as well. So kidney failure for one, And yeah, it's just been a real impact, really impactful disease in my own family. I've lost many family members to it, and have my sister was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, although she's doing really well managing it now. And I was pre-diabetic at a certain point. So in my late 30s, I developed pre-diabetes. And I was wondering why I was gaining weight, even though I was running half marathons at that time. And I was also having like this really interesting phenomenon that I noticed. I would eat a meal for breakfast, and I would have like scrambled eggs on toast. Seems like a pretty reasonable thing to have. And my partner would have the same thing. And I would be ravenously hungry about 2 hours later, and he wouldn't be hungry until the middle of the afternoon. And I was like, what is going on here? Like, why am I having this terrible hunger response so soon after having like quite a reasonable breakfast? And I had no idea what was going on. So I was trying to figure these things out, and I started exploring different dietary options. And in fact, I stumbled across the work of Tim Ferriss, and he wrote this book called The 4 Hour Body. And it's not exactly ancestral eating, but it did sort of tap into certain elements of low carb, which I didn't recognize at the time when I was looking at the recommendations of the way to eat. And but when I tried his way of eating, and as a result drastically reduced my carbohydrate elements in my diet, I started experiencing satiety. And when I would experience satiety, I just wouldn't have to eat so much. And it was a revelation to me that, dropping down the carbohydrates would make an enormous difference. Because I was trained in typical, medical school fashion to follow the Canada's food guide. And that unfortunately tends to be a very high carbohydrate way of eating, and it just wasn't working for me. So when I switched things up, and I would have, instead of 2 eggs and 2 pieces of toast, I would have 3 or 4 eggs for breakfast and no toast, I would experience the same things that my partner was, of not actually getting hungry until 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And it was so shocking to me that my body was that sensitive to carbohydrates. And I learned eventually that that was the insulin blood sugar roller coaster that can be triggered by consuming carbohydrates above your personal threshold for them. So
Yeah.
that sort of came later in my journey about understanding exactly what was going on.
Yeah, it's a journey, all right. We all
Yes.
we were trained in a certain way, and then afterwards we have to relearn things and learn some things afresh. But I'm really intrigued by what you're saying, because I mean, look, you've got the personal experience, which is, worth a lot. But I'm just trying to think of it from the perspective of a First Nations community, because I've seen the statistics on the incidence and prevalence of type 2 diabetes in First Nations communities. So, you know, I think many people dread developing type 2 diabetes, but they sort of think to themselves, well, I hope I never get it. I wonder if I might one day, etc. But it seems to me that if you're living in one of these First Nations communities, you're asking not will I get it, but when will I get it? It's that prevalent. So what must it be like living in a community with that burden?
Well, I've noticed things have changed over the years. The options for therapeutics for type 2 diabetes have greatly expanded over the last 2 or 3 decades. When my grandparents were type 2 diabetic, the only option that they really had was insulin. And they started on that, sort of later on in the disease process. And we know that when type 2 diabetics start on insulin, it doesn't really help. It doesn't alleviate the underlying issue, which is actually insulin resistance. So we're creating more of the same problem, and they often will gain enormous amounts of weight once they go on insulin. And that's understandable. It's a storage molecule. It's a storage signaling molecule. So it's not the solution for type 2 diabetes. It's a band-aid, just like many of the other medications that we use, because those the treatment options that don't address the underlying insulin resistance will not ultimately be successful in helping people to overcome that diagnosis and put it into remission or even reverse it, because there are ways that that can happen. So over the years that I was growing up and seeing this phenomenon of more and more and more people developing type 2 diabetes, it has unfortunately, to an extent, become normalized. If everybody gets it, people just are, it's almost like a fatalistic approach, because what else can you do? However, I would like to have the listeners take a little step back mentally and sociologically when looking at this question. Because when we look at the impact of type 2 diabetes on the First Nation population, what we are seeing is not just the impact of type 2 diabetes as a medical condition and diagnosis, we are seeing a direct impact of colonization. So ever since European contact with Indigenous people in North America, which we call by various other names, Turtle Island being one of them, we borrowed that from our Mohawk relatives out east. Those of us who live or who are Indigenous people here have more recently been introduced to this Western style of eating. And not only the diet, but the lifestyle changes that have come along with European contact. So there's been a massive dietary shift away from our traditional ways of eating. When my father was born in Bella Bella in 1942, there were no cases of type 2 diabetes, and he went on to die of it at age 70. His parents both died of complications of it, having developed it in their middle age. And then now I'm seeing younger and younger and younger people developing type 2 diabetes in their late teens into their 20s. And people struggle with all of the chronic diseases. So they struggle with obesity, they struggle with hypertension, they struggle with type 2 diabetes and pre-diabetes and all of that. But many people are actually quite aware that our traditional diet is helpful and may prevent this. But again, because of colonization, we now live on a reserve system. My people used to live in an enormously broad amount of territory. That was our traditional territory that we moved around seasonally for food gathering. And that's no longer done to nearly the same extent. We're squished into this little postage stamp of real estate in the middle of our territory, but food gathering is now expensive because it requires a boat and it requires gasoline and it requires equipment. And not many people can afford that because there are things like limited job opportunities and limited educational opportunities. And so all of these social determinants of health that impact my people, the population in Bella Bella, and many other Indigenous communities are a direct result of colonization. So once you look at it through that lens, the solutions look a lot different than just introducing the knowledge that a low carbohydrate diet can make a big difference, which it can. Like biology doesn't care about sociology in a certain sense. Like, biology has its own set of rules and it works the way it works. So even if someone, it doesn't care that a population is overwhelmed with, socioeconomic problems, it will still work according to the rules of biology. So in a population, when you have people that are constantly exceeding their threshold of carbohydrate tolerance, and they go on to develop, insulin resistance, we see that ever increasing spiral that it is very, very difficult to reverse. But it doesn't mean that there's no hope, because there are people who have done it. And like, I am a living example of not becoming diabetic because I was able to adapt my way of eating. But not everybody from my hometown had the opportunity to go to medical school and be able to understand, where to get this information and then how to implement it. And they don't have necessarily the economic ability to purchase the foods that would be healthier for them. So our local foods that are brought in from outside the community and are sold through the one grocery store in the community are often relatively highly processed. And there's a lot of junk food, which we know has its own set of problems in terms of being hard to stop once people get going on it. And there's just an excess amount of carbohydrates. We never had rice, but now we love rice back home. It was introduced by the Chinese and Japanese who came over to work in the canneries up and down the West Coast, and they introduced rice to us, and we fell in love with rice. So we're in that way very similar to having that palate, similar to the Asian people, just loving our rice, but it doesn't help with your blood sugar. So we never had potatoes. Those were introduced. Most of our traditional food was protein and fat heavy with some low carb vegetables. And then seasonal access to sweet things like berries.
Yeah.
And that's how my people survived for literally for millennia, where my territory is, my home territory is. And
So
so
Don, I want to ask you a question here, because I mean, to me, it just seems that surely this plague of type 2 diabetes, it's such an obvious manifestation of the harms of colonization. So why isn't this talked about more? Why isn't this front and center on our TV screens and on social media? Maybe it is. Maybe I'm not looking in the right places, but I'm not. You have articulated this so well, but I'm actually surprised that it isn't expressed more commonly. And so to me, it seems there's this flood that is overwhelming us as a result of what goes for a healthy a diet. I'm not even going to say a healthy diet, but the standard American diet, if I can call that. We're overwhelmed by this.
Mhm.
And we feel the need to push back against this somehow. And to me, it seems that Indigenous health is one really good place to start and for leadership to emerge. But again, I'm asking you, I love to hear your opinions on this, but why isn't this just more commonplace? Why isn't everyone shouting out the same tune here?
Well, first of all, if you think of Indigenous health writ large, again, it all goes back to the structural and social determinants that will result in the health outcomes, right? So social determinants and structural determinants. So social determinants are things like geography, your gender, your level of education, your socioeconomic status, all of these things, your access to work options. Those will determine how you can support yourself and live, and what kind of foods you eat, what kind of foods you choose to eat, depending on your level of education, for example. And all of those are at play in this population. And then you take an even bigger step back and look at the structural determinants. These are things like, pervasive anti-Indigenous racism. This is a problem in Canada. It's a problem in the United States. We see endless examples of people who struggle with getting adequate care in the healthcare system, either because they mistrust the healthcare system for very good reasons, or we hear about stories about people like Brian Sinclair, who was a gentleman and a First Nations man who waited in the emergency department in Winnipeg. This was a number of years ago, with a Foley catheter in place that was blocked. And he developed urosepsis and he died in the waiting room. And he was being ignored because of his altered mental state, because people were thinking he was drunk. And he was not drunk, he was in septic shock. And he died as a direct result of racism. We look at what happened to Joyce Echaquan, whom we all may remember in the news, where she went Facebook Live while she was in tremendous medical distress in the hospital in Quebec. And as she was screaming for help, the nurses came along and started to lecture her and call her names, racist names, telling her that she had too many children, and they were completely ignoring the distress that she was in as a result of severe congestive heart failure. And she died because of racism. And how do we solve that societal problem? And it's not that we have not tried to put these things in the front and center of the media and social media. We've done the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples way back in the late 80s, early 90s. We've done the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have done the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry. We have done the In Plain Sight report here in British Columbia, all highlighting the problems of the social and structural determinants of health that are impacting First Nations people. Of the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, how many of those have been enacted by the federal government or at the provincial level? It's not that none of them have, but they are certainly, if you do a report card on the Canadian government or on the provincial governments across this country, they all get a big fat F in terms of implementing the 94 recommendations. So, a lot of the solutions for these problems are so enormous, they're so involved that it's hard to imagine that we could do anything terribly rapidly that would make a big difference. That said, it's not that there are no efforts. It would be tempting to potentially just throw up our hands and say, "Oh my God, the problem is so big, we just really can't solve it." That's not true. I don't think that is true. Indigenous people are incredibly resilient. Here we are, 400 plus years into the colonization process, and we have maintained our identity. We're revitalizing our languages. We've resuscitated our cultures that were attempted to be removed from us through the residential school process. And I think, we focused on so many different things that we've made gains in, and maybe now it's time to shift our focus to the health arena.
Yep.
And there are people who are doing that for sure.
Yeah, and so what you're basically saying, it's a word that I've heard used, is we need reconciliation, not just talk about reconciliation.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
and that term has been used a lot lately to criticize the government, who likes to use the word reconciliation but has very little action behind it.
And,
That
and
said, it's not that there's been no action.
yeah.
Let's say that as well, to be fair. And then, for example, the province of British Columbia implemented a body of legislation called the DRIPA Act. So it's basically in response to UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the DRIPA Act is to actualize that federal not federal, sorry, that UN declaration, and put it into some real um, actionable items in the provincial legislation, so that we have to consider the Indigenous perspective when we build hospitals, for example. So when Indigenous people walk into a hospital, they see the recognition of the territory that hospital sits on, of the people whose lands were taken in order to be able to build that hospital. They see their own art represented. They see their own language represented. So walking into the hospital is not such a foreign experience. And then we begin to alleviate the mistrust of the healthcare system. And then we now have a requirement that residency programs in healthcare for doctors have to include information on Indigenous health, on anti-Indigenous racism and about how do we combat that and how do we eliminate that from healthcare. And changing attitudes is a lot harder than anything. Like how do we change attitudes?
Yeah, and
So
there's one thing we can throw into the mix here as well, as if there's not enough of a mix already. And
yeah,
is so here we are trying to talk about a food first approach to reversing type 2 diabetes. But there's this history in our province of British Columbia of nutritional experiments that were conducted on Indigenous people.
yes.
And so it would not surprise me if there is a fair amount of healthy skepticism and
Yeah.
saying, is this here we go again?
Well,
You're telling us
exactly.
to eat a
And
certain way. It just complicates things, I think.
yeah, the paternalism of medicine is still, unfortunately, going quite strong in a lot of different places. I had community members that I knew who told stories about these nutritional experiments. One of them attended the Port Alberni residential school, and they did caloric deprivation. And he talked about being so hungry that he would go out into the fields of potatoes and dig up raw potatoes and eat them because he was so incredibly hungry, and he risked, being beaten by doing that.
Mm.
And like what kind of a relationship do you have with food when you get out of a residential school system that did that to you,
Right.
right?
So
So,
just changing the question then, it's the same question, but putting it in a different way. What strategies would you use as you're an obstetrician, but as a physician to talk about dietary changes to your patients in a culturally sensitive way? So, to have credibility, so it's not paternalistic as you've used the term. What strategies do you have?
well, first of all, I think knowledge is empowering. And these days, Indigenous people are like every other member of Canadian society. We have access to the internet. We know what Google is. We can do our own research, and our educational attainments over time are gradually getting better. They still lag behind the general population, but we're getting there. So we're seeing this slowly building capacity where people can actually access this kind of information and understand it. However, that's only one, literally, it's only one piece of the puzzle. So knowledge doesn't necessarily change behavior. And smokers know that smoking is bad, that it's likely to give you, problems with your heart, your brain, heart attacks and strokes and different kinds of cancers. They know it. It doesn't mean that it's easy for them to change. Here is where I think a more indigenously centered approach would be helpful. We have survived as Indigenous people because we rely so heavily on each other for all kinds of supports. We have, there's a dynamic in Indigenous communities and cultures that seems to be pretty universal. Maybe it's not entirely universal, but it's pretty universal. And I like to call it laterality. And what that means is we don't think about ourselves in isolation. We think about ourselves in connection to everybody else that we are connected to in our communities and our territories, where we're from. One of the first things when you start interacting with another Indigenous person that you've never met before, where are you from? Who's your mom and dad? Who are your cousins? And like we start to find connections, and it's amazing how often people who live hundreds or thousands of kilometers away will often find someone that we have in common. And especially on the West Coast where I'm from, everybody is connected up and down the West Coast. There's lots of intermarriage between the communities. So, for example, my grandparents, Haisla, Heiltsuk, and Kitasukheches. So that's three nations that produced my family. And we still have relatives that we stay close with in each of those communities. And the relationships that we have with one another are very impactful on how we live our lives. And if we can that my dream would be to, see more pilot programs where we bring people together and we do it in the Indigenous style, according to wherever they're from, respecting their traditions, how people meet, how they gather, how do you discuss important information, who do you bring in, who do you include, and how do we support this process of addressing this health crisis? And if we do it in a heartfelt way, Indigenous led, where we give Indigenous leaders the information and knowledge and empowerment that they need to lead these kinds of interventions, then that is where we will see success. Unfortunately, the success rates are never 100%, but I think we could really be very impactful if we had, diabetes groups that introduced this type of knowledge, that people supported one another and helped to encourage one another in this journey of trying to get their diabetes under control and, reach for the stars. I would love to see a population level remission of this problem back to what it was like before contact with Europeans, before colonization. I would love that. That would be like a life dream for me. But the only way that I would ever see that it could happen is if we do it in an Indigenous context. And we would include things like ceremony. Like, we never gather back in my community without an elder opening those gatherings in prayer. When do Western people do that if they aren't in a church setting, for example? So, having, the gravitas that comes from an elder opening in prayer, it changes your mindset about what's to come in the rest of that meeting. If your elders are applying their stamp of approval to this process and this knowledge that we're gaining by these types of groups, then it's going to mean something a lot different than if it's a doctor lecturing you in the clinic. So, and then what I would love to see is the success stories that we can show people, having Indigenous people who have managed to reverse their diabetes or bring it under good control, and avoided complications. Once we start seeing examples like that, then I think it will light a fire that will spread. That's what I would like to see.
Yeah, we can dream. I mean, we need to dream. And some of your goals that you've articulated there they're lofty. And as you've said, they might never happen, but we have to think along those lines and at least try. And as you've said, I think the more Indigenous physicians, the more Indigenous nurses, healthcare workers, everybody, it helps to be given a message from someone who basically looks like you and sounds like you.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's something that, I mean, I'm a physician from South Africa. I'm never ever going to have the credibility that someone that's Indigenous in Canada will have. But Don, can I ask you, as I really want to ask you about your role as an obstetrician. You're an Indigenous obstetrician, which I imagine is a fairly rare breed in Canada. So, and you've done a lot of work as an OBGYN. Can I start just by asking you a gynecological question, although I really want to get onto the obstetrics as well. And that is just relates to infertility and polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCO, and the relation of that to metabolic health. Is that something that you see in your practice, or not?
Absolutely. It's an enormous problem. I would say it's an epidemic, just like type 2 diabetes is an epidemic. It is a manifestation of insulin resistance.
Yeah.
And once insulin resistance gets bad enough, the physiologic response of the human body in the presence of insulin resistance is to create more insulin, to make more insulin. And the more insulin you have in your bloodstream, and if it goes above, normal levels, we call that hyperinsulinemia. I know you know this, but for the listeners, hyperinsulinemia or elevated insulin levels in the bloodstream it has a whole host of possible impacts, and it manifests in different ways in different people. In women who have polycystic ovary syndrome, they tend to be, unfortunately, very sensitive to it in their reproductive system. When the ovaries are exposed to excess insulin levels, they will not ovulate properly. The developing follicle that is trying to mature and release an egg, where the egg comes out at ovulation in the middle of the menstrual cycle, that process is impaired by the high insulin levels. It causes the cells around that follicle to undergo a change, and they make too much male hormone, and they inhibit maturation of those follicles. This is literally just due to the high insulin level. So anything that brings down the insulin level will improve the ability of the ovaries to ovulate. And when that happens, you can get pregnant.
Yeah.
However, if you just get pregnant because you ovulate once in a while, but you haven't really addressed the underlying insulin resistance problem, these patients have an incredibly high risk of going on to develop going on to develop gestational diabetes. And when they do that, we can see all kinds of complications in the pregnancy itself. They're at higher risk of high blood pressure and all of the complications that go along with that. They're at higher risk of poor fetal growth, of placental dysfunction, premature delivery, cesarean section. Excuse me. So it is a really, really important topic. PCOS can be a predictor of poor pregnancy outcomes. So I try really hard to educate my patients that we've got to get this under control before you get pregnant, and keep it under control once you do become pregnant. And one of the best ways to do that is a low carbohydrate diet, because you reduce the carbohydrates and you focus on whole real foods. Your insulin resistance problem diminishes, and then oftentimes people will start to ovulate regularly, and they can get pregnant, and they don't necessarily go on to develop gestational diabetes. So, it's all connected, and it's not something that you can do in a 20-minute visit. Like that's been my challenge, actually, is working with patients when you've got to pay your bills. You've got to pay overhead. You've got to pay your office staff. You've got to pay the rent. You've got to pay your insurance. You've got blah, 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 blah. So you can't take an hour with every patient and just get paid one consult. It literally it's a challenge. And that's one of the reasons I love being a locum now, because I don't have to worry about all of that stuff, and I can take more time with patients to educate them about these processes. And sometimes it's over a series of visits where you can actually help them to gain the knowledge, and providing other resources for them to access outside of the office.
Right. So Don, how do you approach dietary counseling then with pregnant women? I mean, I think some of the standard advice is, counting carbs and a certain amount of carbs per day. And what you're
Yeah.
suggesting, I think, is something very different. But so how do you counsel pregnant women with regard to their diet, maybe bearing in mind the possibility of gestational diabetes and so on?
Well, first of all, I have to educate them about what's happening in their bodies. And
Yeah.
endocrinology lessons to your patients are challenging, because you've got to adapt them to their education level, whatever language they speak. You've got to be able to bring that information to them in a way that they can understand and then act on it. And I think as a profession, we need to do better in that area. And I know this because I used to be a nurse, and half the time that I spent as a nurse was spent interpreting what the doctor just zipped in, spilled out a bunch of words, and then left. And I would ask the patient, "Did you understand what the doctor just said?" "I don't know what they said. It was too confusing. They were using too many medical terms and blah, blah, blah." If we can't actually effectively communicate with our patients what we're talking about, it's useless. It's literally useless. So I think you have to be an artful communicator with your patients to be able to, have this information make a difference. So I spend time with them. I explain to them, what insulin resistance is and what causes it, and then what they can do. Here are the practical things you can do to not have so much trouble with this. And sometimes it's like you need to cut out sugar. Maybe you should cut out grains. Maybe you should cut out, potatoes and rice. and explain to them why, because all of those things drive up your blood sugar, which drive up your insulin levels. And it's the high insulin that's giving you all of these problems.
So, Don, I'm interested. This advice that you're giving, ideally, I would imagine it starts pre-pregnancy, because we all hear this thing of the first 1,000 days are so important, and it's normally it begins in pregnancy, but really should probably preconception before you've even conceived and you're just thinking of having a baby. That's probably when you need to start making these dietary changes, isn't it?
Absolutely. We see intergenerational, impacts of metabolic problems, stressors, and all of these kinds of things. And they turn on and off, genetic signals. So that's the epigenetic phenomenon that's becoming more and more widely known about. Maybe not the actual inner workings of it, but we know that a baby that is gestated in a uterus that belongs to a mom who has metabolic problems, that baby's epigenetics are not going to be very healthy ones. So a diabetic mom, whether they're type 1, type 2, or gestational diabetic, who's gestating a baby with too much blood sugar, that really, messes with that baby's epigenetics and sets them up for metabolic problems later in life. So the importance of it can't be understated, right? If we can prevent a baby from having a lifetime of metabolic problems by helping the mother to control those things, it's a very worthwhile goal. And most mothers are very, very motivated to do the healthy thing for their babies. So, I find that the patients are usually quite open to it and will do their best to implement the advice as long as they understand and have strategies to support them along the way.
Right. I mean, arguably one of the most important things a mother can do in her entire lifetime is to be healthy in pregnancy. But I've got a question, Don. We know that in recent years and decades, there's been this increasingly younger age at which even adolescents or even earlier than that are developing type 2 diabetes. And that's been a puzzle for many people. We know the diet is terrible, so that's obviously one cause. But is there any possible relationship between that earlier and earlier age of developing type 2 diabetes and the maternal diet in pregnancy? Is there a possible relationship there?
Oh, I would say there absolutely has to be a relationship there because we know those epigenetic switches that get flipped because of being gestated in that diabetic environment are very potent mechanisms to generate the same problem in the fetus later in life. So, gestational diabetes has become an ever increasing problem, I would say since the late 1980s, even. So we're having, moms now who were gestated as infants of diabetic moms, and now they're having their babies. And, it's definitely a problem. And I think it sort of magnifies as the generations move along. The more every generation that was exposed to this problem is going to be more and more prone to this problem based on epigenetics. So, and we can epigenetics are not, that's the good thing about epigenetics, is they're not unmanageable as long as we understand them. And we are learning more and more about epigenetics and how they transmit down generations, and then how we can affect them in individuals. So,
Right,
we're and hopefully affect them for the better. So we
right.
can alleviate some of the concerns that the wrong switches that got flipped, maybe we can flip them back, or at least to an extent.
To an extent, yeah. So as if we didn't have enough problems to deal with already, we can just throw epigenetics in there as well.
Exactly.
Um,
So
but do you have, you say there's generally good uptake from the moms in terms of listening to this advice about and wanting to do the best for their babies, obviously. But do you have some moms who say, yes, I get it, Dr. Wilson. I know what I need to do, but there's the cost and there's the access to foods. And I don't have access to good foods. It's very hard, and I haven't got enough money to buy what I need. Do you encounter that?
absolutely, I do. And that's across the societal spectrum. It's not just in Indigenous patients, because I work with everybody, obviously. It is a challenge, and because if they can't make those dietary changes, they can't access the benefits of those dietary changes. So biology's rules don't care how much money you have. Biology will do what biology will do. And if they can't make those changes, they just won't experience the benefits. And it's one of the tragedies of, this challenge of having people have access to the right kinds of food. There are lots, different places have different kinds of programs for people who are struggling in this way. And in fact, just again, stepping back, we all may be familiar with the news headlines or the news articles that um, food bank usage is up, astronomically high over the last 5 years, and especially since the pandemic started. So that obviously there are people who are using food banks who are then going on to get pregnant, and that's their source of food. So it's very difficult. Prenatal vitamins can only do so much for people. So they're important, but yeah. And then we hear about food insecurity as this epidemic, nationally speaking. And I'm not sure if you've heard about in Saskatchewan, there's a little mini epidemic of scurvy going
Yeah.
on, mostly impacting Indigenous people around La Ronge. And it used to be scurvy was something we thought was a historical disease. And then if you ever saw it, it was worthy of a case report. And now we're seeing these mini epidemics of it. And that's food insecurity. And where does the food insecurity come from? Colonialism. We're back to square one, right? So where it all starts in the first place. And now we're fixing problems that shouldn't have existed in 2024 and 2025. So
Right. When we think of scurvy, we think of sailors in the 17th and 18th centuries.
yes, and this is
We
why
do not
the
we do not think of La Ronge in central North Saskatchewan. Um,
exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
it's horrific.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Don, and just beginning to wrap up here. Oh, I know what I wanted to ask you. Bannock. I had a question about Bannock because to me, Bannock seems very complex because it speaks to me of the resilience of Indigenous communities who have adapted it from what they were initially fed. And it's got this tremendous sort of role in tradition and health, eating and conventions of eating, and it's got this role, but it's also flour and sugar, and it's also a colonial import, really.
Yeah.
That's how
Yeah.
it started. So I'm just wondering how, in all this advice we give to people, I mean, if we're going to say no, you stop eating bannock, that's not going to go down well. But maybe let's keep bannock for feast days and special days and really appreciate it. I don't know. That's my thinking. What do you think on that?
Yeah. So, it's called by many different things, bannock, fried bread, or fry bread. Everyone's got their, sacred recipe that they don't want to share, or, your auntie really, 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 really loves you if she shares her recipe with you, or if she makes you bannock, right? Or fried bread. So it's taken on a strong cultural emblematic importance, and it's hard to mess with those things. It really is. And unfortunately, biology has its own rules, and it doesn't care that it's a cultural emblem, and is culturally important. Bannock is still going to drive up your blood sugar. It's still going to contribute to your insulin resistance. So, it's a journey, like going back to that same, recognition that we wouldn't expect people to walk into your office and then the very next day they're consuming a pristine low carbohydrate diet. It's just not realistic. It waxes and wanes, and people will have good days and bad days, and hopefully more good days than bad days in terms of what they're putting in their bodies, so that they can accumulate the benefits. And it's a lifelong thing. I talk, we some Indigenous people actually recognize that bannock was a survival food, and it's now been claimed as something that we love, and it's tasty. Of course, it gives you this amazing dopamine hit when you eat bannock. It is tasty, but then that also leads to the next discussion that I talk to my patients about, which is the hyperpalatability of certain foods and how those are literally addictive. So, this is why processed foods can be such a challenge, or junk food, because they are designed to give you this incredibly powerful dopamine hit when you take your first mouthful. And, you jokingly see the commercials for things like, there's a type of a corn chip out there. I bet you can't eat just one.
Yeah.
Well, why is that? Because you're getting a crazy dopamine hit from that crunch, the salt, the sweetness, the texture, everything. Your body knows it's about to get a spike of blood sugar, especially if you eat it when you're hangry and you're relieving that. So it can be very, very difficult to give up certain foods. But if you're arming people with information and you say, do you know what is actually happening to you when you're hangry? And explain the physiology of that. And when you eat a carbohydrate snack to fix that, you've just made that problem worse. So how do we prevent it from happening in the first place? So this is where, like, you can't do all of the teaching that patients need in a single visit. I've followed patients for months at a time. I should have sent them back to their family doctor 6 months ago, and yet I still see them on a monthly basis or every 3 months when they're doing really well, just to touch base. And they come in. I'm like, I'm not here to judge you. I'm just here to see how you're doing. How have you noticed you feel when you're eating the low carb approach, and how do you notice when you don't? And just reinforcing the approach for them, because ultimately I'm not the food police. I'm there to help people to be empowered to make their own choices and live a longer, healthier life. And I always emphasize to my Indigenous people, I speak to them a little differently than I do to non-Indigenous people, but I emphasize to them that you have every right to live a long, healthy, thriving life. Nobody says that to Indigenous people. In fact, the messages that we get are exactly the opposite, that we're not worthy of help, we're not worthy of the good things in life, we're not worthy to thrive. And they need to hear that opposite message coming from someone in a position of authority. And so I try to, say these things to my Indigenous patients so that they go away with a nugget that hopefully will be a little seed of something that grows in them. And I talk about, your self-care is one of the ways that you can do that. And we talk about in the Indigenous world about being a good ancestor. And we are, we're all going to become ancestors at one point or another. And if we are, making a big difference for our own health, and we can be there for our children, for our grandchildren, for our nieces and nephews who depend upon us, and we can be there for longer because we've taken care of ourselves, that's very much in keeping with the Indigenous approach to laterality, to how we care for one another. So that's the kind of message that I try to weave in to my nutritional teaching, because you can't just do nutritional teaching and then just leave it at that. Not for Indigenous people. It's not going to fly, and it doesn't fly with most humans, right? So I find even my non-Indigenous people need to hear similar kinds of motivations and reasons to take care of themselves and to make these dietary changes. So
It's very clear what we need to do, Don. We need to clone Don Wilson and export you all over Canada, Indigenous communities all over the place.
if only
But
it was that simple, hey? Like
what a
epigenetics.
dream, yeah. But that's really inspiring. And I mean, the reality is there are people that are getting paid a lot of money to design foods which are just totally irresistible.
Yep.
And we're all victims of that. And it's all about dopamine, as you've said.
Yeah.
Dopamine's very important. But so just to wrap up, I mean, I really have appreciated everything you've said, but is there a kind of universal principles from the traditional Heiltsuk diet that you think can benefit not just Indigenous people, but people of all backgrounds? If you were just to encapsulate and summarize what you've told us already, but the universal principles from that traditional diet, because I know that your life kind of turned around when you discovered this traditional ancestral diet, and it made a big difference in your life, and just scaling that up to the world, really.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
So the reality is, when I discovered the paleo way of eating, which is whole, real food, unprocessed, you're cooking it from its original state, that type of thing. One of the main reasons that resonated with me is that my people were eating a paleo style diet until we had European contact, and then we started having processed things like flour and sugar introduced. So I recognize that. And if you look up on the internet and search for an island called Triquet Island, Triquet, Triquet Island, it's in the Heiltsuk territory, and there was an archaeological dig done there a number of years ago, and they discovered it has been continuously inhabited by people for more than 14,000 years in the middle of my traditional territory. So we have been there for a very long time. Canada is what, 157 years old or something like that. It's a blink of an eye compared to how long we were in our traditional territory. And you look at the archaeological evidence of what people have been eating all that time. Way back in the Ice Age time, it was a lot more land mammals that they were eating. They found atlatls and spears and bows and arrows. And then as water levels rose, our diet shifted towards a marine-based diet. So waterfowl, fish, shellfish, seaweed, sea mammals, that's what we ate. And that's the kind of food we still call our traditional diet, is a marine-based diet. And it's so tasty. I love it. It's talk about a dopamine hit. When I'm eating my traditional foods, it's comfort food, it's soul food. Plus, it's just so nutrient dense, and it's nourishing my body, my brain, as well as all of my social connections and the meaningful connections that I have with my own community. So, food is not only about the nutritional side that it gives, the social side of it can't be neglected. And there's a pride in all traditional dietary practices. Like you think about the Mediterranean people, the Italians, how proud they are of their food, the Greek food, like, and all these the Latin American food. Everyone's proud of their food. And for Indigenous people, it's one way of nourishing that esteem of ourselves and each other, and that dietary life way that we had before colonization is what allowed us to endure for 14,000 plus years. And it's something we could go back to restore some of the health that we deserve to have. And that's kind of the thing that I would like to remind people about is, healthy eating is going to restore things to you. It's not about giving things up. It's about regaining things that we've lost when we're eating foods that don't fit with our biology. So that's the message I would like to convey.
That's a message, and that's a very profound message, Don. I think it's a lovely way to end our interview. Very profound. I just want to thank you once again, Dr. Don Wilson, for taking the time to spend with me today on At the Helm.
Yeah,
I would like
my
to thank,
pleasure.
yeah, that's great, Don. Thank you. I'd like to thank our producer, Ann Mullins, our technical guru, Graham Wheeler. I want to thank IPTN, which is the Institute for Personalized Therapeutic Nutrition, who sponsors this podcast series. And I want to thank RCCBC, the Rural Coordination Center for BC, which inspires me to do this work. Once again, you've been listening to At the Helm. I've been interviewing Dr. Don Wilson. I hope to see you again soon. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.